This morning I'm pleased to welcome Professor Anthony Pinn, the Agnes Cullen Arnold Professor of Humanities and Professor of Religious Studies at Rice University, where he is also the founding director of the Center for Engaged Research and Collaborative Learning. In addition, he's the Director of Research for the Institute for Humanities Studies. Dr. Pinn serves on the Board of Directors for the American Humanist Association and is a chapel advisor for Houston's Rothko Chapel. He's the author or editor of 31 books, including Introducing African American Religion from 2013, Writing God's Obituary, How a Good Methodist Became a Better Atheist, out this year, and The Two Disciples, a novel, forthcoming in 2015. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Pinn.
Good morning. Oh, come on. I traveled all the way from Houston. Good morning. That's better. That's better. Thank you so much. This is my first time with you, but I tell you, I have new friends and I have old friends, and I'm grateful to all of you for coming out. Thank you so much. I'm an academic. That is my training. That is my life. But I've come to realize that there are dimensions of our individual and collective lives that are best expressed through the poetic. When I was younger and had more energy and a bit more hair, this came across for me in a poem that I learned quickly because my brother told me it would be good to know this poem. And so in my best Barry White voice, I would use this poem. She walks in beauty like the night of cloudless climes and starry skies. And all that's best of light and dark, pause, meet in her aspect and in her eyes. It said something about the nature of human connection, even for me back then, something about the nature of human connection that isn't adequately captured through my academic jargon, or even the challenges of our existence. It matters not how straight the gate, how charged with punishment the scroll. I am the master of my fate. I am the captain of my soul. That just speaks to the oomph of human existence in a way that my academic jargon just doesn't. There is something about cultural production, something about the ways in which we map out the cultural worlds in which we live, when done through the poetic, that just speaks. It speaks. One of my favorite songs is by Nina Simone. Perhaps you know it. I'm going to assume you know it. Even if you don't, shake your heads like you know this song. Feeling Good. That's my jam. That is my song. At one point she says, freedom is mine and I know how I feel. It's a new dawn, it's a new day, it's a new life, and I'm feeling good. That's my workout song. When I'm in Houston and it's a running day, I put that on and it just loops. Just that one song for as long as I run, and it just loops. People may not understand the smile on my face as I'm running in 85% humidity, but that is my jam, and it just loops. I carry this with me. And so yesterday morning, I got up at an early hour, and I got dressed, and I was going to run along the lake. I stepped outside, experienced your Chicago Saturday, 47 degrees. Went inside and thought, well, this will work just as well in the gym. Now, think about it. I grew up in Buffalo, New York. 47 degrees, that was summer for us, but the blood thins a bit. But I grew up in Buffalo, New York, and the weather should be of no consequence to me. My family moved to Buffalo quite some time ago as part of the Great Migration, that mass movement of African Americans into northern and southern cities following the promise of opportunity. My mother's parents moved from Halifax, North Carolina to Buffalo. My father's family moved from Dinwiddie, Virginia to Buffalo, looking for opportunity. My mother's parents were college educated, but in North Carolina, that didn't mean very much. But they wanted different opportunities for their children. They wanted their children to occupy space in such a way as to allow them to just be. So they moved to Buffalo, New York, because right outside of Buffalo, New York was Bethlehem Steel. There were job opportunities in Buffalo, and my grandparents moved there in pursuit of these opportunities. My mother's parents were deeply religious, committed Christians, Baptist. And some of my earliest memories are of being at my grandfather's Baptist church in Lackawanna, right outside of Buffalo, New York, just watching. I'm a kid, so I'm watching. And as a kid, I came up with games to occupy my time. And with my friends, we'd play this game. Everyone had a hymnal. And the key was this. Everyone would quickly open up the hymnal. And the idea was to land on the same page. And if everyone landed on the same page, and you had picked that page, you won. And the game started over. But here was the real challenge. Not letting my grandfather see you do this. It just took a look. He did not have to speak a word after service. It was just that look, and you knew once he gave you that look, it was done. We attended that church for quite some time, and then my mother decided that it was not the place for us because it was providing some rather bad lessons with respect to issues of gender. That this was a church in which women, because they were women, were not allowed to exercise leadership outside of positions that were all about caregiving. My mother didn't want me learning that lesson. So we started attending a small independent church much closer to our home in the inner city of Buffalo, New York. My sister and my mother joined this church first, and I'm a little kid, and there was nothing my sister Linda could do that I couldn't do as well. She joined the church. I'm going to join the church. So one day after playing my game and taking a little nap, I woke up and I saw people walking to the front of the church, and I asked my mom what they were doing, and she said, they're joining the church and giving their lives to Christ. And I said, well, I'm going to do that too. So I got up and I walked to the front and I shook the woman's hand and I said, my name is Anthony Bernard Pinn, and she introduced me to the church, and that was that. From that moment on, I was involved. Weekends, some evenings, certainly Sundays. It was a small church, so the pastor taught Sunday school in addition to preaching. And one Sunday morning, we sat in his office in a circle, and he asked this question, what do you want to be when you grow up? And the typical things were said, lawyer, doctor, firefighter. He got to me, and I said, preacher. I'm not quite certain why I said this, but I said it, preacher. I wasn't certain what this would mean. How would he react to this? I had given this no thought. It wasn't premeditated, but I said, preacher. So he shook his head and said, okay, we start next week. So I'm young. I can't even go to the corner store alone. But that following Sunday, he started me on a different path. I lined the hymns. I collected the offering. I said prayers. I did everything except preach. It was a different phase, and no one raised questions because within the context of my church, Methodist church, it was assumed that God could use anyone. Calling was not restricted by age, and so the real test was productivity. What does this young person do? From the perspective of most, I had the right look. I didn't get in much trouble. I did fairly well in school. Of course, a preacher, so I was on this path. And life was different. There were ways in which childhood ended for me at that point because I was meant to be set apart. I continued along this path, and this minister left, and another came, a young man from Philadelphia. He was brought to my church in Buffalo because he was known as a church builder. And he had taken a small church in Philadelphia and had grown it. So he was sent to Buffalo to take this small church and grow it. At this point, we were part of a new denomination, the African Methodist Episcopal Church, the oldest black denomination in the country. We were part of this, and he was going to grow this. And he had been told, there's this kid, Tony, who he's called. God has God's hand on this young person. He's called to preach. And with time, this new minister gave me an opportunity. I was a preteen, and I preached my first sermon, and that was the start of it all. I couldn't vote. Had to be in the house before the street lights came on. But I was now in the pulpit telling people how to prepare their souls for eternity. I couldn't vote. Had to come inside before the street lights came on, but I'm telling people how to prepare their souls for eternity. That first sermon, my family was so proud. My grandfather Hargrave, my mother's father, gave me his Bible to use. Now, this is a big deal. He gave me his Bible to use. This Bible was important in my family. It wasn't just a book of scripture. It told our story. In the back, he recorded births, marriages, deaths. It told our story, and he gave me this to use. So I preached my sermon, my version of Jonathan Edwards' Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God. I condemned most to hell, but I wasn't going there, right? Because I knew the way, but most of those folks sitting out there didn't look so good for them, and I let them know. But the real test was not really the poetic quality of my words. The real test for preachers in that denomination is the outcome. Do people come to Christ as a result of what you said? 3 people came, so I was on my way. Folks said, he's not just playing. There's a real calling here because people have given their lives to Christ as a result of what he said. I was on my way, and life was now different. I'm a preteen, but not really supposed to act like a preteen. Life is changing for me. My body is changing. My mindset changing. My interest changing. But I had few ways in which to wrestle with that conflict. Few ways in which I could say, because I was now a minister and I was supposed to have the answer. I was supposed to have a different and a special relationship to God and to Scripture. I had answers. Questions? No. Answers. So I continued on this path, and my grandmother told me, this is wonderful. My grandmother Hargrave said, this is wonderful, Tony. This is wonderful. We are so proud of you, but understand this. I would not make use of a doctor who didn't have an MD. I would not secure the services of an attorney who did not have a JD. And my grandson is not going to be a preacher without proper training. So it was clear at that stage that college and after college, seminary. And my oldest sister, Joyce, at that point was in a PhD program, History of Education. And I thought to myself, well, if the PhD is the best you can get, my sister's getting it. If I can't get 2, at least I want 1. So it was clear to me I was going to college, I was going to seminary, and I was going to get a PhD. It was set. So I'm working in this church. I'm a preteen, and now I'm a youth pastor. I'm responsible for the spiritual well-being of young people, many of them older than me, right? I'm doing this. I'm all sorts of work, and all I have is a calling, no real training, but this is what I'm doing, and I'm feeling that this is my life. This is what God wants me to do, that this is what I should be doing. So I did the best I could. As I got older, I moved into high school and started attending a school that was meant for gifted students. But my mother and I, being prayerful, decided that this was not a good location for me, that I needed to be around people who held the same beliefs. So I transferred to a small high school outside of Buffalo called West Seneca Christian School. It was run by a Southern Baptist congregation, and it was a feeder program for Bob Jones University. I'll let that soak in. For Bob Jones University, they came to recruit twice a year, and we sat in the chapel and we were into it, right? It was a feeder school for Bob Jones University. I wasn't going to Bob Jones University. I had bigger aspirations than Bob Jones University. This was not for me, but I was in this school, and I had difficulties when it was time to apply to colleges because I was determined to go to a secular university, and this made no sense to my teachers. A secular university? Why in the world would you do that? But I was going to a secular university. This is what was going to happen, period. So I'm applying to schools, and the pastor of my church is reassigned. He's going to a rather large church in New York City, actually Brooklyn, and within Brooklyn, Bedford-Stuyvesant. And I decide Columbia had gotten in, and from my perspective, this was the Lord working things out. This pastor would be in Brooklyn. I'd be in Manhattan. It's a train ride. I'd continue being mentored by him. This is just wonderful. Right? I thought to myself, isn't it just grand when God's plan unfolds? Just wonderful. I made my way to New York, and you know, it's still my favorite city in the United States. It is the place where I feel home. It's the place where I can breathe. So I packed up and I moved to New York, and I encountered a world for which I was unprepared. I'm taking courses at Columbia University, courses on biblical interpretation, and I'm thinking, of course these folks understand the Bible the way I understand the Bible. It is God's word, period. They treated it as literature, and they did this in a way that was unapologetic, and it just blew my mind. I'm encountering people who don't believe what I believe, and they're not worried about it. You know, this is just mind-blowing. I'm 18 years old. I'm used to people thinking what I think, believing what I believe, and moving along. And these folks did not believe what I believed, and they were okay. And what really freaked me out is these people who, from my perspective, were bound for hell, often treated me better than folks in churches. Think about it. I'm 18 years old, and this is just freaking me out. And in Brooklyn, I'm a youth pastor at this rather large church, and I'm encountering young people who are daily faced with the threat of death. And I mean this literally. Bedford-Stuyvesant then is not what Bedford-Stuyvesant is now. It was a rough terrain, and I'm working with these young people, and many of them have an easier time envisioning their death than they do envisioning a productive life. And I'm talking to them, and I'm not saying anything that seems to be making a difference, that what I told them seemed to be of little consequence. I'll give you an example. Issues of sex and sexuality, I'm supposed to deal with them. I'm 18, 19 years old, and I'm supposed to deal with them in a way that is scripturally accurate. And so during one session, thinking myself rather clever, I told the young people this: look, I understand you're going to date. That's fine. But remember this. You do whatever you want to do, pause, recognizing that Jesus is in the room with you. And I just thought, brilliant, inspired, right? But I didn't really give them anything that made a substantive difference in how they understood and approached life. I didn't tell them anything that gave them a more robust sense of their own value and worth. And this started to trouble me. It really, really, really hit a high point when I was a junior. As a junior, I was responsible for being present for the 6 a.m. service on Sunday, but that was no big deal, right? I was sleep deprived, and we took great pride in our ability to do all-nighters. And so the fact that I would sleep maybe a few hours and get up on Sunday was a wonderful thing, right? I only had 3 hours of sleep on Saturday, right? I mean, this sort of thing was a wonderful thing. So that didn't bother me. What bothered me was going to the church and being uncomfortable with what I was expected to say, because it didn't seem to make a difference at all. So that junior year, I'd leave my apartment, make my way to Broadway, and catch the number 1 train. But not that first one that came. I'd let it pass. And I'd let another pass. And maybe I'd catch that third. And I'd make my way to 59th Street, and I'd get off there because I needed the A train. But not that first one that came. I'd let that pass. And typically, I'd let the next one pass. And maybe I'd catch the third. I was timing this, you have to understand, timing it so that I'd get to church without obligations. I'd be too late to participate. So I could arrive after that slow walk from that train station in Brooklyn to the church. After that slow walk, I could arrive, sit in the back, kind of shrug, and at the end tell the pastor, "Doc, I'm sorry, the train." I didn't give him the full story, but that was sufficient, and it gave me an opportunity to breathe. I was becoming uncomfortable with my theology because it seemed to have no real-world application. It did not speak to the circumstances of life. I seemed to be answering questions that at least the young people weren't answering, and this was becoming really difficult for me. I was still a committed Christian at this point, but my sense of myself and my sense of ministry and my understanding of God were changing. No longer was God this booming presence that broke into human history and made things happen. At best, God was that small, quiet voice attempting to persuade us to do the good. Still committed to ministry, and I'm preparing to go to seminary. I'm still going to be a minister, but a different type of minister. I'm going to be a minister like Adam Clayton Powell Jr., for whom changing life circumstances was the true calling. Protesting trumped the pulpit, and this started making sense to me. I was going to be that kind of minister, but I knew I could not go to seminary in New York City. I couldn't go to Union across the street from Columbia because I needed to get away from my church family in order to think thoughts, to have questions. And so I decided I was going to go to a place that wasn't known for ministry, where faculty members belonged to denominations, but that was probably the extent of it. They were not hardcore Christians. I decided Harvard was the place for me. I could think these thoughts, I could wrestle, and I could do this away from my church family. This worked for me. So I packed up and I moved to Cambridge, Massachusetts. And I started working at a small church in Roxbury, across the street from a park. And Roxbury in '86 had a very different look than Roxbury in 2014. Mass Ave and Washington, very different look then. But across the street from this church was a playground. It was the kind of playground where basketball hoops had metal chains, not net. Yeah, very different park. And in this park, people played games, but it was also a place of despair and desperation, drug deals, prostitution. And I'm a youth pastor at this church, as I had been in New York. And I'm dealing, again, with young people for whom life is fragile and fractured at best. Again, young people for whom the smell and the feel and the taste of death always present. And I didn't have much to say. The pastor in charge would tell me, "Well, it's your time to preach, Tony, and let the people get happy with you." But I wasn't so happy. Right, I had a theology, but it didn't seem to make a difference. I had a faith, but it didn't seem to make a difference. It didn't seem to dent the despair that marked the world. This was painful for me, and my theology shifted again. There's pressure on campus to think about religion in a particular way, and I'm trying to fight that as best I can, right? Kind of absorb what makes sense and leave the rest behind, and I'm in a religious context where what I do have doesn't seem to make much of a difference. This was a struggle. I changed my theology, I changed my thinking as much as I could, but I reached a point where I had to make a decision with deep consequences for me. Did I care about people, or did I care about my tradition? Which would hold priority? The people or the tradition? And I decided the people mattered more. The people mattered more. So I contacted the pastor of the church and said I would not be coming back. And I wrote to the bishop in charge of my district of the African Methodist Episcopal Church and told him that I was surrendering ordination, that I would no longer be involved. I just couldn't do it. I struggled to be in the pulpit. I felt dishonest in the pulpit. I'm still preaching, even a modified theology that doesn't make much of a difference, and it's a theology that I'm doubting. And there were lots of things I was willing to be in this life, but I was not going to be a hypocrite. I was not going to pimp people for a paycheck. I could not be in the church, so I left. I left. I wasn't quite certain what I was at that point. I knew I was no longer a Christian. And with time, I would come to believe that it wasn't just Christianity that was problematic. It was theism in more general terms that didn't give us an adequate life map. I knew what I wasn't. I wasn't a Christian. Not quite certain how to think about this in positive terms back then, but I wasn't a Christian any longer. And I was okay with that. I was fine with it. And I was fine with it because I had wonderful conversation partners. Henry David Thoreau kept me company many a day. And I was marked by some of the things he had to say in Walden. And of course, I paraphrase, but the idea that we should move through life deliberately so that when we reach the end, we know we've lived. That made sense to me. Or the idea that we really should strive to be good, that we fixate on doing good. And from my perspective, the religious tradition I'd left fixated on doing good and gave limited attention to being good. But what he said made perfect sense to me. He argues, look, I'm not impressed with the person who gives me something to drink or gives me something to eat or provides clothing. I can find a Newfoundland dog that can do as much. But for him, what really mattered was being good. Adjusting who we are at our very core in such a way that how we approach the world, our posture towards the world, is always and already directed toward the well-being of others. That made sense to me. Richard Wright also kept me company. His book, Black Boy, spoke to me. At one point in the book, he argues, look, my grandmother wanted me to be a part of the church, and she realized that she couldn't get me in on her own, so she contacts his buddies and tries to get his buddies to work on him. And it doesn't really amount to much. He argues, yes, he went to church on occasion, but what he found most compelling was the music and the beauty of the minister's wife. He found her rather attractive. And he says this, and this is what stuck to me. And I paraphrase, if he had encountered the hymns, the stuff of church life before he had been slapped by the world, it would have meant something. But a cruel encounter with the world came first. And it taught me this, that there's a proper hermeneutic to use with respect to engaging life and moving through life, and that hermeneutic has to do with our experience, that we question the tradition, not our experience. If there's anything that is true with a small t, it's our experience. It's how we as embodied bodies move through the world, affect it, and are affected by it. This meant something to me. Or Alice Walker, The Color Purple, or Toni Morrison, these figures meant something to me. So before I had physical humans with whom I could be in conversation, I had these friends to walk me through this transition. I ultimately found myself within the Unitarian Universalist Association. It took me some time, but eventually I found myself there, and came to call myself a humanist, a non-theistic humanist, that I am comfortable with the idea that it's just us. And we are part of this messy and complex web of life. And we do what we can to make a difference, recognizing that our best efforts often come at the expense of others. Produces a kind of measured realism, a type of humility to our movement through the world. All of this, for me, over the course of these years, now 50 for me, all of this, for me, is filtered through something my grandmother told me as a high school student, but something that it has taken me years to appreciate. She sat me down in her kitchen and she said this: move through the world knowing your footsteps matter. Move through the world knowing your footsteps matter. And so I think when I am at my best, I'm living the truth of Annie Hargrave's words, trying to move through the world knowing my clumsy, awkward footsteps matter. Thanks so much.